Many of you probably know that the EU has begun targeting its own citizens and foreign residents with foreign policy measures by placing them on the Russia-Sanctions list, such as my compatriots Jacques Baud and Nathalie Yamb, as well as the German Hussein Doglu. Today, I want to talk about this extra-legal approach with one of Germany's most prominent legal experts. Joining me is Dr. Hans-Georg Maassen, a German lawyer and former senior intelligence official who served as president of the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution from 2012 to 2018. Dr. Maassen, welcome. Good day, Mr. Lotaz. Dr. Maassen, you have also commented on these sanctions. What can you tell us about them, and how do you currently assess this instrument of the EU?
Well, the instrument of sanctions was developed in the early 2000s, and at that time it was quite understandable from a foreign policy perspective. The system works like this. The Council of EU Foreign and Security Ministers adopts a decision that certain states and also individuals are to be sanctioned. To sanction means assets within the EU are frozen, they can no longer be accessed, no business transactions may be conducted with those states or individuals, and the affected persons are generally not allowed to enter EU territory. So these are very, very severe sanctions that are imposed, and all that without a court ruling, without a hearing. This decision is made by the Council of Foreign Ministers in Brussels.
In
the early 2000s, it was actually understandable to everyone when people said, well, North Korea has to be sanctioned. Iran has to be sanctioned. That's also a foreign policy tool. That's quite clear. Ultimately, the goal is to use such sanctions to push another state toward different behavior, whether that means improving the human rights situation in North Korea or getting Iran to halt its nuclear program. And in a second step, people said, fine, if the states are being sanctioned, then of course Kim Jong-un and Khamenei must also be sanctioned. It can't be that the state is sanctioned while Kim Jong-un still drives around in his Mercedes S-Class, while the country suffers. So the state leadership was sanctioned, as were family members, and the broader political circle, generals, ministers, was also sanctioned. In the 2000s and 2010s, that was basically unproblematic, and everyone would have said, that's fine. In 2022, with the second Ukraine crisis, meaning the Ukraine war, the Russian state leadership was then sanctioned. Before that, individual people had already been sanctioned. I'm thinking, for example, of the generals or the head of the Russian service, who after the first Ukraine crisis was no longer allowed to enter the EU. And people said, okay, that's fine. And then, in the last year or two, after basically the entire leadership had been sanctioned, the focus shifted to the oligarchs, where from a European perspective, one could say, okay, these are the major supporters of Putin, the billionaires who keep their money in Swiss, German, or British banks. Yes, that should be frozen too. Politically, that could ultimately be justified without giving much thought to the legal question. Or hardly any lawyer asked whether they were even allowed to do that. Yes, these are serious, even severe, human rights violations being carried out there. And last July, I met a good acquaintance who had been sanctioned because of a close personal relationship, he's German, with Putin. I couldn't believe it. He lives in the Black Forest and told me he no longer has a bank account. He's not allowed to work. He's not allowed to own any assets. He doesn't even have a credit card. At first, I just couldn't believe it. Simply his friendly relationship with Putin, because he had worked at Gazprom, ultimately led to that. And then, more and more cases became known to the public. You mentioned the German journalist Doku, the journalist from Anti-Spiegel who lives in Moscow, and a woman named Lip. They were put on the sanctions list on the grounds that they were spreading disinformation about the war in Ukraine, that they were spreading pro-Putin propaganda. And when you look into the EU's official journals, where such sanctions are announced, and read the reasoning behind them, you have to say, it's so utterly ridiculous that any lawyer's hair would stand on end at what is presented there as justification. That's not a justification. Those are boilerplate phrases that actually mock the very idea of reasoning. And just before Christmas, the Baud case became known, a former Swiss colonel in the general staff who earned great merit in Switzerland, in the military, in military intelligence, who was attached to NATO in Brussels on behalf of the Swiss army, and who was often deployed abroad as an independent, neutral observer. He was sanctioned without a prior hearing. His assets are frozen. He is not allowed to leave Belgium. That's the country where he currently resides. No one is allowed to give him money. That means even if he works, his employer cannot pay him because he is sanctioned, because he falls under the sanctions regime. And I have to say, this is a serious human rights violation. From a legal perspective, I must say, it's incredible that such a decision is made by ministers without an adequate legal basis. Even a serious criminal convicted by a court would not be treated this way. But these politicians presume to commit, I would say, this injustice by treating people like that.
The problem is that these sanctions, and you've illustrated this beautifully, have gradually become an instrument that's been expanded step by step. But sanctions are a tool of foreign policy, and they fall under the arm of the EU's foreign policy. That's why the whole matter is in the hands of EU bureaucrats, Ms. Callas, who ultimately draft these recommendations, present them to the Council, and then the Council makes the decision. And it's not a legal procedure. It bypasses all the legal mechanisms that should actually apply within the member states. And that's why the people on this list can only appeal to the EU Court of Justice, not to national courts. So it's not really a judicial instrument, and that's why I actually call these sanctions extra-legal, not illegal, because they've been made compliant with EU law, but they circumvent the normal legal process. How do you see it?
Den normalen Rechtsweg. Wie sehen Sie das?
I see it exactly the same way you just described it. You know, that would be like the ministers for environment and climate protection meeting in Brussels and saying, we're now imposing sanctions on climate deniers. In doing so, they would ultimately bypass criminal law, civil law. The entire judiciary would be completely ignored. If you say we're starting right at the top, with ministers making the decisions, then why do we even need a judiciary anymore? They decide, and you can file a complaint against it. That's what Ms. von der Leyen says too. So what did she actually mean by that? He can, of course, file a complaint with us again, and he can also appeal to the European Court of Justice. What's being done here is a complete circumvention of our legal system. That there can be foreign policy sanctions is conceivable. That's an instrument of foreign policy, an instrument of diplomacy. But targeting individuals alone is a completely different matter. A judicial procedure should have been provided for that. There should have been a court proceeding in which procedural rules are established, but also in which the sanctions are tied to truly specific, substantive facts. That means anyone who does this or that must expect to be sanctioned, just as is provided for in our criminal law, for example. The claim now being made by the Commission is that sanctions are not a punishment, but are meant to lead to different behavior. Our legal system does not allow the state to re-educate people who are acting legally. Just imagine, Mr. Baud has not committed any crime. He's behaving completely correctly, exercising his right to freedom of expression, so that such people may be sanctioned by the state in order to make them behave differently. But that's exactly what the EU Commission wants. And that is, as you say, extra legal. It seriously violates our fundamental rights and human rights. Our federal government should never have agreed to such a decision in Brussels because it's unconstitutional. In effect, this undermines our entire legal system. But they agreed because the decisions were made unanimously. And by the way, the procedure reminds me of a remark Jean-Claude Juncker made many, many years ago, rather flippantly.
The former president of the European Commission.
Exactly. The former president of the European Commission basically said, yes, first we do something and cross a red line, and then we see how others react. Most people don't notice. And if no one notices, we take another step, and then another step. And before they realize it, we've already reached our goal. And then we say, what's the problem? We've always done it this way. And my impression is that it's the same in this process. It starts with sanctioning states. Then, with people where many would say, that's fine. Sanctioning Kim Jong-un, the generals in North Korea sanctioning Putin, people would say, that's fine, without thinking much about what consequences that might have. Then you take another step and go after dual citizens living abroad. You could say, okay, fine, he's also a German citizen, but he's been living in Russia for many, many years. Fine. Even then, no one seems to think about the fact that these are serious, even severe infringements on fundamental rights. And then they take it a step further, targeting their own citizens and constructing, and one really has to say constructing, as in the case of Baud, a supposed closeness to Putin, constructing the idea that someone is spreading pro-Russian propaganda. Because when you read Baud's texts, I don't see any pro-Russian propaganda there. The man expresses his own convictions. You can debate them, but ultimately it's not propaganda. And even if he were spreading propaganda, he's allowed to. He's allowed to. Just as people are allowed to spread pro-Ukrainian propaganda.
That's really the insidious part of the whole strategy. That the public debate, you can see it in Switzerland too, is being steered toward the question, is he doing propaganda or not? If yes, then the assumption follows, well then sanctions are justified because the accusation must be true. If not, then we have to discuss it. But that's not the point at all. It's legal to say these things. The rule of law in Germany and Switzerland protects these rights. But now we've reached the point where, at the federal press conference in Germany, we have bureaucrats who, in bureaucratic German, say yes, we have to refer you to another ministry, and legal recourse is available. Because you can either go to the EU Commission, that is, the ones who imposed it, the people who did it, and say, I don't agree. And you're allowed to appeal to the EU Court of Justice. The EU Court of Justice, as I learned from Sandra Hofer, will not examine whether these sanctions lead to human rights violations. It will only check whether the charges are internally consistent. Whether the charges themselves are lawful, meaning whether they constitute a legal violation, will not be reviewed. That makes it even worse. The court, too, as long as there's no lie in the reasoning, will let it stand, so it can say whatever it wants. That's how Sandra Hofer explained it to me.
Yes, that's also correct. I mean, this so-called court proceeding is ultimately a farce, which they're now referring the affected people to. But the crucial point is, and this must be said again and again, that what Mr. Baud and the others are doing is lawful. They're allowed to do that. The issue isn't whether it's Putin propaganda or not. One should say, it doesn't matter at all whether it's Putin propaganda. Even Putin propaganda can be spread. That's how it is. That's freedom of speech. No punishment should be imposed for that. And besides, it should also be pointed out, we are not in a state of war with Russia. Even in this case, you can't just say, necessity knows no law. State of emergency. We have to protect ourselves from Putin's propaganda. No, we still maintain that we are not in a state of war with Russia. Therefore, you can't even declare a state of emergency here in order to restrict freedom of speech. So what's happening here is a serious infringement on freedom of expression. And that must come first. Not the question of whether propaganda was being spread or not, or whether Mr. Baud's statements and those of others are correct. That doesn't matter at all. The crucial point is, he has the right to say whatever he wants. And one more thing, as a citizen, there is also passive freedom of expression. I have the right to read what I want to read. And Ms. von der Leyen has no right to regulate my reading habits. If I want to read or listen to RT Deutsch, then I have a right to do so. What the Commission is doing, namely restricting my access, is a violation of human rights. So freedom of expression doesn't just mean that I can say or write something. It ultimately also means that I can form my own opinion with the media I choose to consume, and those must not be regulated by the state.
Und die dürfen vom Staat nicht reguliert werden.
I always assume that's clear. But what we're seeing right now is that a public debate is taking place. Freedom of speech is a precious good, but it doesn't mean you're allowed to spread Putin's propaganda. Yet that's exactly what we need to emphasize. Freedom of speech means you're allowed to speak for or against something, to believe something. I'm allowed to say God exists, even if that might be nonsense. I'm also allowed to be publicly wrong. I'm allowed to say something and be mistaken about it. How do you explain that we've now reached a point where this is up for debate?
Of course, not everything is coincidence. There are people who actually think about these things. How can we narrow the range of acceptable opinions? And a lot of law gets mixed with morality or morally elevated. Who in Germany or Western Europe would want to stand up for Putin propaganda? Well, go ahead. It really takes a certain amount of courage to say, I think it's right that there's also Putin propaganda in the EU. That does take, speaking as a lawyer, too, a certain amount of courage. So in that sense, the other side, meaning those who fight against freedom of expression, have it relatively easy to say, well, we can't allow Putin propaganda.
Also Putin-Propaganda dürfen wir nicht zulassen. Ja, und viele sagen, ja, passt schon. Putin-Propaganda dürfen wir nicht.
And many say, yes, that's fine, we can't allow Putin propaganda. And once that hurdle has been cleared, it's of course relatively easy to say that freedom of speech can also be restricted, and that these people can be sanctioned. The other side uses this technique by turning Putin propaganda into a political and moral taboo. No one says, we think it's right that Putin should also be allowed to spread propaganda here. But by making it taboo, it becomes easy to undermine the law in public discourse by saying, if it's taboo, then a sanction must follow.
Wenn das tabuisiert ist, dann muss auch eine Sanktion folgen.
In your opinion, what can be done at the moment? Well, I can think of three options. Either you appeal to the EU Court of Justice and try to get it to address the consequences and implications, or you take the human rights route. There's the European Court of Human Rights, for instance. And then there's also the UN, meaning human rights courts, or various commissions that could be approached. And in my view, there's a third option, to appeal to German courts and argue that these sanctions must not be implemented by Germany because they violate human rights. Which of these do you consider a viable path? Or which paths do you see as viable?
Also, alle Wege sind natürlich gangbar.
Well, all paths are of course possible. I'll start with the one that's the most obvious. So what the Commission said, you can file a complaint with the Commission. That's a kind of appeal procedure, without deadlines, without much effect, and in all likelihood it won't lead anywhere. The path to the European Court of Justice, well, it may be that this path to the Court of Justice is successful. You already quoted Ms. Hofer's statement earlier. Basically, there's no substantive review. They only check whether any procedural errors were made. We're talking here about the legal dimension. I've always been at the intersection between law and politics. Lawyers are part of a social system, and like ordinary people, are often actually quite cowardly. It can happen that a judge at the European Court of Justice completely goes against the mainstream, but that's rather rare. So that means if the European Commission, the Council of Foreign Ministers, all the member states have gone along with the sanctions, and possibly even the Advocate General of the European Court of Justice takes a similar view, then the judges at the European Court of Justice won't go against the current. It may happen, but I consider it unlikely. To change that, we need to build public pressure. That the political dimension of the whole issue is clear in Luxembourg at the European Court of Justice. That it is also shown that there is a broad movement within societies against these unjust decisions, these sanction decisions that are unjust. This needs to be communicated to the public. Otherwise, I see relatively little chance. That's why it's important that we do an interview. That's why it's important that there are these signature campaigns, which in the end may not bring what some expect. That politicians will say, sure, we'll do that, we'll implement it that way, the decision will be reversed. The crucial thing is to raise public awareness of the problem. Because we must not forget one thing. I tried to illustrate this earlier with the example of Jean-Claude Juncker. He keeps pushing past the red lines and moving them further and further until they reach their goal, even if it's extra-legal. It can go even further. So, the Baud case is not the last one. Others will be affected as well. It's already been publicly mentioned that Roger Koppel might also be targeted because he did interviews in Moscow. And then others will be targeted too. That means we have to show these people in Brussels the red line. And then we have to go back and say, these cases must not happen.
No, it's a
political case. It's political harassment. And unfortunately, it can't really be addressed legally, as bad as that sounds. But the troubling thing about the EU Court of Justice is that even if the court ultimately rules that the sanctioning based on that reasoning was unlawful, the European Commission can simply change the reasoning at any time. And we've seen this happen. There are two Russian oligarchs, Russian businessmen, who successfully filed a lawsuit. The EU Court of Justice said it was invalid. The European Commission then just used a different justification, and as a result, they're still on that list today. So, we're completely at the mercy of the European Commission's arbitrariness here. I wonder how it's possible that 27 member states then say yes to this. But that's another question. The fact is, when they say yes, it's hard to go against it.
Richtig, ja. Also, dass sie Ja sagen, liegt einfach
Right,
an diesem
yes.
System.
So the fact that they say yes simply comes down to this system. There will be a working group of the Council, I imagine, a sanctions system below the level of the Council of Foreign Ministers, where colleagues from the respective justice ministries might also play a role. But I think, as we've already pointed out, this sanction is a diplomatic measure, a political, foreign policy measure. So, staff from the respective foreign ministries will be part of the Council working group. They'll draft a preliminary decision. And you have to picture it. When those 27 or 26 sit together, they know each other, they like each other, they know the staff in the EU Commission. They're not going to attack one another or start criticizing each other. And once they've made a decision in the Council working group, it goes to the Council of Ambassadors. The Council of Ambassadors will then prepare the meeting of the Foreign Affairs Council, and it won't be discussed any further there. I think it's highly unlikely that a case like this would be discussed in the Foreign Affairs Council. It'll just be waved through because it's already been prepared beforehand. That's why it's necessary for us to bring it up to the political top level so that ministers in countries critical of the European Commission also deal with it and, if necessary, use their veto in Brussels to prevent this sanctions system from continuing in its current form.
Nicht mehr in dieser Weise fortgesetzt wird.
Das sehe ich auch so. Ich frage mich trotzdem.
I see it the same way. Still, I wonder, may I come back to this again, about taking the legal route? Is there a court in Germany that Hussein Logo could appeal to and say, please intervene? I mean, I'd like to construct a case in which the court decides that these sanctions may not be enforced. Is that possible?
Gibt es diese Möglichkeit?
Also man kann natürlich immer ein Gericht in Deutschland anrufen.
Well, of course, you can always take a case to court in Germany. The question is whether the court would consider itself competent in this matter. I'd say that, in case of doubt, they would say, this is not a German state measure. You'd have to go to an administrative court, and they probably wouldn't even accept the case, especially pointing out that the European Court of Justice has jurisdiction. It's a political decision from Brussels, and any challenge to that political decision would have to be brought before the European Court. It's possible you might end up before a chamber of an administrative court that says, great case, we'd love to handle it, and now we can construct jurisdiction because Article 19, Paragraph 4 of the Basic Law says that you must have legal recourse against everything. It's possible they'd construct it that way, but those would have to be very bold and politically engaged judges.
Ja, politisch engagierte Richter sein.
Okay, also es tut mir leid, als Nicht-Jurist
Okay.
weiß ich einfach nicht, wie sich
So,
das System
I'm sorry. As a non-lawyer, I just don't know how the system works. I assumed that the review of whether a case can be admitted or not would be relatively straightforward. But I didn't realize that there's still room for discretion there, and that courage also plays a role. But that's just how it is in this case.
Das war mir nicht klar, aber das ist halt einfach so in dem Fall.
Ja, also die Regeln sind relativ klar.
Yes, well, the rules are relatively clear, but of course these rules can also be interpreted accordingly, because the overarching principle is there must be legal protection against any state action. And if judges are of the opinion that this legal protection is completely inadequate, especially at the European level, since there are no courts of fact there, courts of fact are instances that conduct a full examination of evidence, and the fact that no hearing took place beforehand. The hearing is fundamentally an expression of the rule of law. So it may be that a judge says, okay, at the European level there is no legal recourse equivalent to Article 19, Paragraph 4, so we'll do it ourselves. I can imagine that being constructed that way. But as I said, you need judges who actually want to do that, and who have the political backbone to follow through.
Und die auch das politische Rückgrat haben, das zu tun.
Würde es Sinn machen,
Would it make sense to appeal to the Human Rights Court in order to build political pressure?
anzurufen?
Ja, sicher. Also den Europäischen Gerichtshof für Menschenrechte kann man
Yes,
anrufen.
of course.
Die sprachen auch
So one can appeal to the European Court of Human Rights. You also mentioned appealing to the United Nations courts or arbitration bodies, which, however, first of all, operate over very long periods of time. That won't be of much help to Baud either, and ultimately cannot issue binding decisions. The EU is not a member of the UN Covenant on Civil and Political Rights of 1966, which is what this is about. The European Court of Human Rights is also a court of the Council of Europe, not the EU Court of Justice. One could appeal to it for human rights violations. That's something to consider. But even there, the wheels turn very, very slowly. And that doesn't really help Lebsenisch and Baud or the others either.
Damit ist letztendlich Baud und auch den anderen nicht wirklich geholfen.
Was ist Ihre Einschätzung bezüglich
What is your assessment regarding foreign nationals? A special case with Baud is that he's Swiss, and Switzerland is not part of the EU. Another fellow citizen of mine, Nathalie Yamb, is also Swiss. She has also been sanctioned. She is currently in Africa and cannot return to Switzerland because of these sanctions, as overflight is prohibited, which is actually a violation of international law, since every citizen has the right to return to their own country. How do you assess this situation? After all, sanctions were originally intended as a foreign policy tool meant to target foreigners.
Ja, auch da hätte man gesagt, wenn es Osama bin Laden gewesen
In that
wäre,
case,
irgendwo in
people would have
Afrika
said,
aufhält
if it had
und
been
über
Osama bin
Europa,
Laden,
weiß ich
who
nicht,
was
ein
somewhere in
terroristisches
Africa
Ziel
and wanted to
abreisen will,
travel through
hätte man
Europe,
gesagt,
well, I don't
bitteschön.
know,
Ja.
to a terrorist target
Während
country,
hier bei
they
Frau
would have said,
Yamb war
that's
es ja
fine.
überhaupt gar
But
nicht
in
so.
Ms. Jamp's
Abgesehen
case,
davon
it
ist die
doesn't fit at
Schweiz
all.
assoziiert,
Apart from that,
abgesehen
Switzerland
davon
is
über ein
associated.
Rahmenabkommen oder ein
Moreover, a
Verknüpfungsabkommen
framework
derzeit noch
agreement
die
or a
Schweiz
comparable agreement
diskutiert,
is currently being discussed in
wodurch die
Switzerland,
Schweiz im Grunde
through
genommen
which
einen
Switzerland would
bedeutenden
essentially
Teil
adopt a
des
significant part of the EU legal system.
EU-Rechtssystems
What
übernehmen
is being
würde,
done here simply doesn't fit at all.
überhaupt gar
And as
nicht
for Ms. Jamp, who is being denied the right to return home to Switzerland, that is, in any case, a serious violation of her fundamental rights and freedoms.
ist das ein schwerer Eingriff in ihre Grundrechte und Grundfreiheiten.
Sehen Sie denn auch die Gefahr, dass eben dieses
Do you
System
also see the danger that this system will be continued? You've already hinted at it. One can imagine measures being taken against critics of climate change. The EU has now figured out how to steer or even prohibit domestic political discourse using foreign policy tools, and in doing so, it can immediately bypass all legal channels itself. But the people who do this are, of course, extremely well protected by political immunity and so on. They can practically never be held accountable for such actions. Do you fear that this system will be further expanded if we can't stop it?
Dass dieses System weiter ausgebaut wird, wenn wir es nicht stoppen können.
Ja, Sie müssen sehen,
Yes, you have to see, as I said earlier, some things happen by chance, but usually less than one might think. And I believe this expansion of the sanctions system was no coincidence either. But as I said, they tested step by step how far they could go. And now it has reached the Baud case, involving some German citizens who had to be sanctioned. I can easily imagine that if there is no public resistance here, they will simply keep going. And if you look at the Baud case and also the Jamp case, these people are not Putin propagandists. They expressed an opinion, and that's where we get to the core of the matter. Why?
Und da reden wir eben letztendlich den Kern. Warum gerade diese Leute? Warum werden sie sanktioniert? Sie werden ja nicht
Why these
sanktioniert,
people in
weil sie,
particular? Why are they being
davon
sanctioned?
ausgehen,
They're not being sanctioned because they're spreading certain propaganda on Putin's behalf, but rather Mr. Baud, for example, is a renowned military expert with a high level of expertise, reputation, and credibility when it comes to analyzing what's happening on the battlefield in Ukraine. He knows the Russian military very well because as a military intelligence officer, he has dealt extensively with Russia. So that means, when he comments on the war in Ukraine, when he says something about the capabilities of the Russian army, it carries more credibility than if just any random journalist or politician were to comment on it.
Journalist dazu äußert oder ein Politiker, ja, auch einem Verteidigungsminister würde man letztendlich.
In the end, one wouldn't find a defense minister's political position any more or less credible than that of Mr. Baud, who is known to be an expert and essentially has no political ambitions, but simply describes what he observes. That's why he is indeed dangerous, because he presents a position that runs counter to the Brussels line and to that of most EU member states regarding the war in Ukraine. I'll leave aside whether his analyses are always correct. That's a completely different question. As we've said, within the bounds of free speech, he can also be completely wrong.
Im Rahmen der Meinungsfreiheit auch völlig falsch liegen. Aber das ist seine Analyse, aber offensichtlich wird sie als
But that's his analysis. Obviously, it's considered dangerous. That's a dangerous opinion, and he's a dangerous person because he's not just anyone, but someone who could ultimately disrupt the EU's Ukraine policy. And that's why he's being sanctioned. That means the pretext was alleged Putin propaganda. In Ms. Jamp's case, things seem to be a bit different. She apparently also expressed criticism of the war in Ukraine, but was even more critical of France's actions in the Ivory Coast. That's apparently the country she comes from. She's a Swiss citizen, but with roots in the Ivory Coast.
Her roots are in Cameroon, but she worked in Côte d'Ivoire for a long time.
Ja, jedenfalls, so habe ich es verstanden.
Okay, yes, anyway, that's how I understood it. She deals with Europe's neocolonialism in Africa. And my impression is that this woman, also because of her political engagement, is indeed a significant figure who, politically speaking, can get in the way of some European states. And that's why she was sanctioned. That means citizens are being sanctioned here, in this case, Swiss citizens, because whether due to their political reputation, their extensive experience, analytical ability, or political engagement, they get in the way of certain member states or the EU. And that must not happen. And to answer your question, there is a risk that similar things will happen in the future, and that this will continue to develop. That if someone gets in the EU's way on the Greenland issue, the US issue, or other topics, that could ultimately become grounds for being sanctioned.
Einen Anlass gibt, sanktioniert zu werden. Und Außenpolitik ist im Zweifel immer Innenpolitik.
And foreign policy is, in case of doubt, always domestic policy. Just imagine someone expressing criticism of the Rio Pact, the Climate Protection Agreement, or the Kyoto Protocol. Then it could be said that this person must be sanctioned because they are undermining the global efforts of humanity, of the global community, to protect the climate. So this danger can exist if one continues along the path that has been set in motion by sanctions over the past 20 years. That's why it must be stopped. That's why the sanctioning of individuals from EU member states and other citizens must be reversed.
Der EU und von anderen Bürgern rückgängig gemacht werden.
Ja, das sehe ich genauso. Und man sieht im Moment ja auch,
Yes, I see it the same way. And you can see right now how this Russia sanctions list is once again just the next slice of salami. In Switzerland, they would call that the salami tactic, because you cut off piece by piece until the whole sausage is gone. You can see how the sanctions list is being used to address issues that have nothing to do with Russia. So, Ms. Yamb is an example of how France can now take action against an unwelcome citizen.
Das andere Beispiel ist der deutsche Hüseyin Doğru.
The other example is the German Hüseyin Doğru, who has mostly worked on Palestine and primarily commented on that topic, but now still ends up on the Russia sanctions list. The justification for this sanctions list even mentions his engagement for Palestine or his reporting on Palestine protests. You can think what you want about that, but the fact that this reporting appears in a justification that's actually supposed to be about Russia, it just defies comprehension. And that's exactly why it's so hard to explain to the public, because it sounds so absurd. But it really is that absurd.
Aber es ist so abstrus.
Das ist in der Tat völlig abstrus.
That is indeed completely absurd. And as a lawyer, I have to say that the EU Commission doesn't even hesitate to make something like this public. It's unbelievable. I mean, it's obvious to everyone. Gaza has nothing to do with being pro-Putin. The Ivory Coast or Cameroon have nothing to do with Putin propaganda. And yet, all of this is mixed together, and this concoction is then used as a justification to go after a person.
Als Begründung genommen, eine Person zu sanktionieren.
Also eben der Test, der ultimative Test, der im Moment.
So the test, the ultimate test that's happening right now, if we follow your explanation, is whether the general public in the EU accepts that the EU leadership has an absolute instrument of punishment that is subject to neither review nor legal recourse, and can be based on whatever one wants. It stands. So I think that's the question, isn't it?
Es gilt. Also ich glaube, das ist die Frage, oder?
Ja, das ist die Frage, dass hier, wie Sie sagen, extra.
Yes, that's the question. That here, as you say, extra legal instruments of punishment have been developed that are far worse than what some criminal courts impose. Jacques Baud told me, in prison, at least you still get food and don't have to pay rent. He has his 570 euros, has to pay legal fees, has to buy his own food, and he says, strictly speaking, they're not even allowed to sell him food, because that too is a service granted to him and therefore sanctioned. So yes, it's a sanctioning instrument equivalent to severe punishment, while the Commission in its statement, or the EU in its usual euphemism, still claims we're not punishing. This is a corrective measure for education. And what's being ignored is that no one is allowed to do that except legal guardians. And the right to educate a person ends at the age of 18.
Menschen zu erziehen endet mit dem 18. Lebensjahr.
I'm honestly at a loss for words that something like this is happening. Fortunately, we still have dedicated journalists in Germany. First and foremost, Florian Warweg from Nachdenkseiten, who repeatedly confronts the spokespersons of the Federal Republic from various ministries at the Federal Press Conference with certain facts, among them the Baud case. And there, you could see how the spokesperson, I don't remember from which office, said something like, well, these sanctions come from the EU, so they have nothing to do with us, meaning Germany.
Der EU haben also mit uns, also Deutschland, nichts zu tun. Da müssen Sie sich an die EU wenden. Zweitens sind wir doch der Überzeugung, dass
You'll have to take that up with the EU. Secondly, we believe that the EU is acting lawfully here, and anyone engaging in propaganda should be careful now. It's being communicated openly. It's not just a quiet attempt at intimidation, but a publicly communicated mechanism of intimidation that's being used right now. And whether the public actually notices it or not, that's probably something the EU will be looking into, right?
Darüber wird sich wahrscheinlich die EU, das wird sie sich wahrscheinlich anschauen, oder?
Also ich habe diese Filmsequenz aus der Bundespresse.
Well, I watched that film clip from the Federal Press Conference too, and I actually found it almost cute how the spokesperson for the Foreign Office expressed himself there with an almost childlike innocence and said yes, and anyone who expresses Putin propaganda in the future needs to be careful. They can be sanctioned just the same. I think that person actually believes that's right, and he can't even imagine that one is allowed to engage in Putin propaganda. I have a legal right to engage in Putin propaganda if I wanted to. Yes, that's what we have a constitution for. That's what human rights are for. People are also allowed to engage in Ukraine propaganda. They're also allowed to engage in US propaganda. I'm also allowed to say, I think Trump is great. That too falls under freedom of speech.
Das fällt unter die Meinungsfreiheit. Aber dass ein Spitzenbeamter, und so sehe ich den Pressesprecher des
But the fact that a senior official, and that's how I see the spokesperson of the Foreign Office, acts as if it were completely normal to forbid someone from expressing propaganda or an opinion in that regard, that is really, I'd say, shocking. I wonder where this man was during all his education. He must have graduated from high school. I assume he studied something. That nothing seems to have stuck when it comes to fundamental rights and freedoms. If this were happening in an authoritarian state system, I'd say it's understandable. That's how people there were raised. That's their self-image. But that this is now the self-image of this federal government, to defame people with dissenting opinions as Putin propagandists, to silence them, to sanction them. That is truly shocking.
Das ist wirklich schockierend.
You were also president of the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution. Doesn't that actually have any impact on the agency itself? Because here, a fundamental right, guaranteed by the German Constitution, is being overridden. Shouldn't someone in that organization react and say, hold on, we've got a huge problem here?
The problem is now also appearing, I'd say, in the Foreign Office, the Justice Ministry, and other ministries, where someone should have said long ago, things are completely getting out of hand here. I wonder, what do we have a Justice Ministry and an Interior Ministry for, both responsible for upholding fundamental rights and our Constitution? Someone should have said long ago, our colleagues in the Foreign Office have completely gone off track. They're not exactly the brightest legal minds working in the Foreign Office. You don't become a diplomat because you're an outstanding lawyer, but because you have other qualities. Something should have been said long ago, but it wasn't. The Office for the Protection of the Constitution, and I say this now as a former head who is now also being monitored by his own staff, has meanwhile developed other legal problems. It too has gone off track. It is now being misused to fight so-called delegitimizers and disparagers of the government. In Germany, it should actually be completely unthinkable for something like that to happen. But I mean, It fits the picture when, on the one hand, people are now being sanctioned by the EU Commission or by the Council of Foreign Ministers because of a differing political opinion on the war in Ukraine, on Gaza, or on Africa policy. And then in Germany, people are being monitored because they criticize the government or make jokes about politicians. That in Germany, people, let's say, experience a house search at 6 in the morning, police units conducting a raid because someone tweeted or posted something on X that was critical of the government. That fits the picture. It shows that freedom of expression is in retreat, and it is being restricted, deliberately, massively restricted, by those in power.
Massiv eingeschränkt von herrschenden Kräften.
Ja, das ist wirklich
Yes, it's really eerie, because I actually thought that we in Europe had developed mechanisms to defend ourselves against this. And I come back to Germany. I'm Swiss, but I think Germany accomplished quite a lot after World War II, both East and West. And in the West, above all, the Basic Law, which essentially contains protections against the state. In other words, to say no, something like National Socialism will not happen to us a second time. The Basic Law is above all the citizen's right vis-à-vis the state, to keep the state at a distance and to safeguard the rights of citizens. But now it seems that this has been very cleverly undermined from above.
Klug ausgehebelt worden zu sein, von oben.
In der Tat, ich nehme es auch so wahr.
Indeed, I see it the same way. Fundamental rights and human rights are defensive rights. They are meant to protect citizens from an overreaching state. Unfortunately, in recent years, Germany has adopted a new construction through the Federal Constitutional Court's climate protection rulings, according to which the climate has a sort of supreme fundamental right to be protected. And ultimately, fundamental and human rights are being allocated to citizens within the framework of climate protection. This has effectively turned our Constitution upside down, because fundamental rights are not meant to protect the climate from people. Rather, fundamental rights exist, and they are historically linked to National Socialism, to protect citizens from an overreaching state and also from overreaching judges. Unfortunately, judges have now also become part of the problem rather than part of the solution. This development has continued in recent years and has led to this erosion of fundamental rights. You rightly pointed out that the Basic Law was written as a departure from National Socialism. One must not forget, and I say this because I taught law for many years, it's not about what is written in the Constitution.
Es kommt nicht drauf an, was in der Verfassung drinsteht. Ja, es kommt gar nicht drauf an. Das Grundgesetz kann noch so schön geschrieben sein.
It doesn't matter at all. The Basic Law can be written as beautifully as you like. What matters is how the Constitution is lived and implemented. You only have to look at the last constitution of the GDR, I think it was from 1967. Most of what's in the Basic Law in terms of fundamental rights was included there as well. Only the practice was completely different. The danger with any constitution, with any law, is that legal practice can drift entirely away from the legal text. And that can only happen when politicians, civil servants, and even judges tell themselves, well, the political objective is more important than the wording of the law.
Ist wichtiger als der Wortlaut des Gesetzes. Und das hatten wir in den letzten 20 Jahren.
And we've seen that time and again over the past 20 years in Germany and Europe, where the law was bent so far that it was almost broken. Laws do have a certain structural strength, but they were pushed very, very far, whether it was in the context of the Euro rescue or the nuclear phase-out. People didn't pay attention to the law, to the fact that the government is also obliged to abide by the rule of law, but simply did whatever they wanted. And unfortunately, the lawyers went along with it and wrote it all up nicely afterward.
Yes, unfortunately, norms only have real power when people actually believe in them and want to put them into practice. And unfortunately, we're currently in a process where the very norms of law are being turned upside down. Dr. Hans-Georg Maassen, Is there anything you haven't mentioned yet that you'd like to add, or have we more or less covered the topic?
Beifügen möchten oder haben wir das Thema ungefähr abgedeckt?
Ich glaube, das Thema haben wir relativ breit abgedeckt.
I think we've covered the topic pretty thoroughly, and we'll all have to wait and see how things develop over the next few months. That was, let's say, a status update on the Baud case, and maybe there will be another opportunity to talk about it again.
Und dann gibt es vielleicht wieder Gelegenheit, noch einmal darüber zu sprechen.
Ja, das sehe ich auch so. Es kommt
Yes,
darauf an,
I see it that way too. It also depends on who starts speaking out against it now. And there are different ways to do that. You can write letters, send emails, you can go to demonstrations. I just want to say, it's a political problem that we have to tackle together through political action. Mr. Maassen, for people who would like to read more from you, is there a place, a blog, where you publish your writings?
An dem Sie Ihre Schriften veröffentlichen.
Ja, über meine Webseite HG Maassen mit 2 A's.
Yes, through my website, hgmaassen2a2s.com, that's my website. Or you can easily find me on Twitter, which is now called X, or on Facebook.
Leicht finden oder bei Facebook.
Ich empfehle
I recommend everyone take a look at the writings and essays of Dr. Hans-Georg Maassen. Dr. Maassen, thank you very much for your time today.
Gladly, Mr. Wolfgang.